Welcome to Diplomacy Today, a podcast series by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. At this platform, we discuss global developments, Pakistan's diplomacy, and the important role Pakistani diplomats play at the international stage. I'm your host, Mumtaz Zahra Baloch, spokesperson, Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Today's program will focus on climate change, and it is my great honor to welcome Ambassador Shafqat Kakakhel, a prime expert on climate change matters in Pakistan. Ambassador Shafqat Kakakhel has served as Pakistan's High Commissioner in Nairobi and permanent representatives to the United Nations Environment Programme. He also served as Deputy Executive Director of the United Nations Environment Programme and as Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations. Welcome, Ambassador Kakakhel.
My pleasure.
So let's start from the basics. The international framework on global climate change has evolved in a major way internationally. Can you share with us this framework and how does it work for developing countries like Pakistan?
Yes. Well, climate change has been recognized as a defining challenge of humankind. It is a relatively recently recognized problem, but a problem that will decisively impact on the welfare and well-being of human beings, of ecosystems, of the entire international community. Basically, the global consensus on climate action comprises 4 or 5 elements. The first element is mitigation. It is recognized that all countries of the world, the international community, has to work together to mitigate the effects of climate change by switching over to clean energy, stopping deforestation and other practices. There's also the question of adaptation. The second pillar is adaptation, which is that even if you try to mitigate climate change, there will be some impacts which cannot be prevented. So the impacts will be stronger or more serious for developing countries which have had no role in creating this problem. So adaptation is the second pillar. The third pillar is that for the necessary changes to mitigate climate change, you have to have science and technology. And the fourth pillar is capacity building in developing countries. And for all these 4, you need the fifth pillar, which is finance. So these are the essential pillars of global action.
So, Ambassador, as we have been seeing that Pakistan is among the countries most affected by climate change. And it is becoming increasingly important for Pakistan to take action against this looming disaster. How effective we have been in instituting policies to deal with the challenge of climate change, and can you also elaborate what are the major actions that we are going to take in coming years?
One of the most significant initiatives in recent years is what is known as the Indus initiative. Because Pakistan's lifeline is the Indus Basin, which provides provides livelihood to most of us. Our water resources come from the Indus Basin, and we are critically dependent on agriculture, which is also based on the basin. So the Indus Initiative is a major initiative to regenerate, to resuscitate the productive aspects of the Indus Basin. And we have also developed new policies for renewable energy, for encouraging the switch over to cleaner energy. There is the alternative energy policy, and we hope that by 2030, I mean, it was estimated that with international support, 60% of our energy will come from clean renewable energy. So basically, a lot of work has been done on the institutional arrangements. We have a law on climate change, which was adopted way back in 2017, and the Climate Change Council has been established, which is headed by the Prime Minister. Civil society is being enlisted, the support of the civil society. Universities have established departments of environmental studies in which there has been increased attention to climate change. So all these efforts need further development, further consolidation, and for which we have to mobilize our own resources, our own efforts, as well as the support of the international community.
You mentioned 2030 as the year by when Pakistan should have 60% renewable energy. Do you think we are on the path to achieve that goal? And what would be the major component of this clean and renewable energy? Water or solar or nuclear?
Basically, it is the expansion of our facilities for solar energy, for wind energy, and also the electric vehicles. The effort is to ensure that, starting with public transport, already all new buses are mostly electric vehicles, and we hope that by 2030, a greater number of vehicles, both private and public transport, will use electricity as the source of energy for the vehicles, because emissions from vehicles are an important factor in Pakistan's emissions, and if we are able to switch over to electric vehicles, it will be a major success.
For developing countries like Pakistan, which are disaster prone, how does the global climate negotiations and debate impact, and does this framework work for countries like Pakistan?
Well, it was recognized right at the beginning, during the first Rio summit, which recognized the problem of climate change, that although developing countries have not contributed to the creation of the climate problem, because climate change has basically happened as a result of the massive induction of the use of fossil fuel for producing energy for all human uses, for use in factories, in homes, in offices, and all human activity. That developing countries will suffer, and they will therefore need they will need support, adaptation, coping with the impacts of climate change. They would need technology support, they would need capacity building support, they would need finance. Unfortunately, while some progress has been made in all these areas, the quantum of support, the quality of support given to developing countries has not matched the magnitude and scale of the challenge.
So, what are the priorities for Pakistan in these climate change conferences and in negotiations? And do you think Pakistani diplomacy is matching with the requirements that we have at the global climate arena?
Well, as far as Pakistan is concerned, we need support for both, for our mitigation efforts as well as adaptation efforts. We need, for instance, support for clean energy, because we have enormous potential for clean energy, hydropower, solar power, and the potential for wind energy is also tremendous. But we don't produce the equipment that is needed for all these renewable energies. So we need support in manufacturing or in getting these at concessional rates. We also need support for adaptation.
And in the global climate change negotiations and the COPs and the different conferences, what are the priorities that Pakistan has when we participate in these conferences, looking at the challenges that Pakistan faces in the climate change issues?
I don't know how many people recognize that Pakistani diplomats have played a great role in the development of global consensus. For instance, Pakistan served as chair of G77 on 3 occasions. The first time it was in the preparatory process for the International Conference on Environment and Development, which happened in Rio in 1992. Pakistan was the chair. And that is the conference that delivered the international agreement on climate change. The second time we were holding the chair was in 2007. And it was Ambassador Munir Akram, who proposed the ideas on climate action, a new consensus on climate action. And the third time was at the Sharm el-Sheikh conference, and it was Pakistan's leadership which helped in achieving consensus on the perennial question of loss and damage. And because that issue had been hanging since the Rio summit, but the Sharm el-Sheikh conference 2 years ago in 2023 reached consensus on the establishment of loss and damage fund. So Pakistani diplomats have played a pioneering role. What is needed is continued involvement of our diplomats in Geneva, in New York, in Nairobi, and all the places. And in fact, all our diplomats should be aware of diplomatic efforts for climate change in order to get support from the countries of their accreditation for Pakistan's climate action.
Moving on to climate finance. You said that is also an important pillar of the global climate framework. The developing countries have special needs as far as their response to global climate challenge is concerned. And internationally, there are some resources available. Do you think there is adequate financing available for climate action, or are there some gaps? And if there are gaps, how to bridge those gaps?
Yeah, in United Nations Convention on Climate Change mentions the need for financial support from developed countries to developing countries for climate action, but it did not specify the amount or the mechanisms. Over the years, the mechanisms have been established, and in Copenhagen in 2009, an agreement was kind of mentioned for $100 billion annually to be provided by the developed countries for climate action in developing countries. Unfortunately, the developed countries have not been able to mobilize 100 billion. The maximum that was mobilized was about 87 billion. We hope that the figure of, not only the figure of 100 billion will be reached, but there will be an agreement on a higher ceiling in future for climate action, because the climate deterioration is accelerating, and there is need for accelerating efforts to mitigate climate change. And so far, I would say that developing countries are not fully satisfied with the quality of support from developed countries. There is some kind of a recession of political will in the developed countries when it comes to supporting developing countries on climate change and other issues.
So you are saying that we are yet to see developed countries fulfill the promises that they made at Copenhagen several decades ago. And yet there is now a new term that has come about, and that is the loss and damage. That is perhaps, first can you explain to us the difference between climate finance and loss and damage? And with the establishment of loss and damage fund, do you think there would be adequate funding available to fulfill both these baskets of financing for developing countries?
Well, developing countries had demanded that there should be a commitment, a clear commitment, and maybe even the amounts should be mentioned, and there should be a process for periodic replenishment of the resources of loss and damage fund. But that was not possible because the United States and other developed countries vehemently opposed that demand. And finally, a consensus was reached on the establishment of the fund, but without committed funds. So we have an apparatus, but no commitment for funding. What has to be done and what will be done is that developing countries will continue their efforts. And we have constituencies in the developed countries in the form of civil society, and also the scientific community, like the Union of Concerned Scientists, has been an effective, very strong forum on behalf of developing countries. So we have to continue to try to convince our partners in the developed world that it is in their interest, as much as in the interest of developing countries, to have effective climate action.
And the distinction between loss and damage and climate finance, if you could explain for our viewers.
Basically, climate finance is finance needed for every activity. For instance, mitigation. You know, if you want to switch to cleaner energy, it costs money. So you need finance for all kinds of renewable energy, for better vehicles, for use of hydrogen, for use of nuclear energy, for electrification. It all requires climate. Loss and damage are the consequences that cannot be repaired, or can be. Loss is those that are irretrievable. Damage is the effect which can be remedied if there are resources. So these are the two dimensions: damage which cannot be undone and damage which can be undone. And that's the distinction. But the availability of resources, the availability of technology, the availability of capacity are the essential prerequisites for all aspects of climate action.
That was very comprehensive, and thanks for explaining it, because that clarifies this question also in my mind. Now, coming to policy, how can we mainstream climate action as a policy tool in our foreign policy interactions with countries around the world? And should it be an important pillar of our foreign policy, especially in bilateral domain?
It should be, for the simple reason that we need to learn from the best practices of other countries, both developed and developing. And developed countries have made major progress in renewable energy and in the getting more out of less, fuel efficiency, energy efficiency. So our missions in developed countries can serve as the bridges of communication in those areas. As far as developing countries are concerned, we also need our missions in developing countries to tell us which developing countries have done better in terms of forestation, reforestation, preventing deforestation, in terms of renewable energy. How have they been able to manage? What are the best practices? What are the technologies? What are the institutional arrangements? And our government can try and replicate with necessary adjustments those best practices.
Do you think regional approaches to climate change are useful? And especially in our South Asian context, how do you see the practicality of having joint approaches in tackling the challenge of climate change?
Well, regional cooperation has been recognized as an effective way of augmenting the efforts of the international community. And basically, this recognition also takes into account the fact that, for instance, take India, Pakistan, we share the same geography, we share the same ecology, we share the Himalaya glaciers, we share the monsoons. And our economies are contiguous. So what happens in eastern Punjab affects the situation on our side of the border. So there is a need for regional countries to work together. While SAARC may not have actually achieved results, it had done a lot of work at the level of formulation of policies and schemes. So there were plans of action, there were initiatives on monsoons, there were initiatives on disaster, there were initiatives on water resources, and there were regional centers were established in 5-6 countries on major impacts of climate change, and that work must not be allowed to vanish, to disappear completely.
Thank you, Ambassador Shafqat Kakakhel, for coming to Diplomacy Today and discussing with us the challenge of climate change, the essential prerequisite of making climate action an important pillar of our foreign policy, and the implications that climate change negotiations have for countries like Pakistan, and the action that we need to take at the global level. Thank you very much. So that was Ambassador Shafqat Kakakhel. We are grateful that he could join us for today's episode of Diplomacy Today. This is a podcast series by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where we discuss international issues and global developments, the implications for Pakistan, Pakistan's foreign policy, and the important role that our diplomats play around the world. See you next time. Thank you very much.